Michael Harper faced the unimaginable. The HOA, led by the ruthless Karen Whitmore, tried to auction off his $2.3 million family ranch during his father's funeral. Karen thrived on control, exploiting grief and bureaucracy to intimidate, showing no regard for the lifelong legacy Michael's father had built. But with his brother Jake by his side, Michael turned the tables, confronting Karen directly and sending a clear message that the Harper family's resolve could not be broken. Just wait until you see how the showdown unfolded, and how justice was restored in a way no one could have predicted. The morning air was crisp and still, carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves and freshly turned soil. Michael Harper adjusted his black suit jacket for the third time, though it did nothing to calm the trembling in his hands. Today should have been about farewells, about the quiet honoring of a life well lived. His father, a man who had spent decades nurturing the Harper Ranch into a sprawling $2.3 million sanctuary of land and family memories, now rested in a polished oak casket. The chapel smelled faintly of lilies, the soft murmurs of grieving friends and distant relatives echoing off the high ceilings. Each face Michael met mirrored his own sorrow, some silently crying, others clutching hands for support. He had barely begun the eulogy when his phone vibrated in his pocket, a mechanical intrusion into a deeply human moment. Hesitation gripped him. He almost ignored it, unwilling to break the fragile silence. But instinct won. He slid the phone from his jacket and glanced at the screen. The name flashing there made his stomach turn. HOA office. A cold dread swept through him like ice water spilling into his chest. Karen Whitmore's voice came through crisp and clipped, each word sharpened with a precision that had always unnerved him. "Mr. Harper, we've scheduled the auction for the ranch. All documents have been finalized. Bids will start at 2 p.m. today." Michael froze, the phone slipping slightly in his grasp. The world tilted. Auction. Today? During his father's funeral? His heart pounded with a mixture of disbelief and rising fury. This was no bureaucratic error, no oversight. Karen had orchestrated this, knowing full well the significance of the day. She had a reputation for being relentless, for pushing homeowners to the brink. And now, she had crossed a line that even the most hardened residents wouldn't have dared to imagine. The chapel seemed to constrict around him. Voices became muted as if filtered through a fog of shock. Each detail Karen mentioned, bids, schedules, finalized documents, felt like a calculated strike designed to maximize humiliation and pain. Michael's hands tightened around the phone as if he could crush the injustice in his grip. He could almost feel the cold satisfaction in Karen's tone, the way she thrived on making others uncomfortable, the subtle undercurrent of delight in turning a personal tragedy into a public spectacle. The weight of the moment pressed down on him. Memories of his father flooded back, not just the laughter and warm lessons, but the tireless care that had gone into maintaining the ranch, the late nights spent repairing fences, the early mornings tending to orchards and livestock. His father had built this place from the ground up, a legacy of dedication and love. And now, in the midst of grief, someone was trying to strip it away. Someone was weaponizing paperwork and policies to make a family's sorrow a tool for gain. Anger ignited like a spark in dry kindling. It wasn't just frustration or disappointment. It was something deeper, a raw, instinctive sense of injustice. Michael's pulse raced, heat rising to his face, but he knew he couldn't let it explode here. Not in the chapel where friends and relatives watched, where mourning demanded solemnity. Yet the rage pulsed beneath the surface, a silent storm gathering strength. He imagined Karen at her desk, perfectly coiffed and precise, tapping her fingers in satisfaction. Reading emails filled with thinly veiled threats and passive-aggressive warnings. She thrived on control, on asserting power over others, and now she had made grief her instrument. Michael's mind raced through the possibilities. Lawyers, emergency injunctions, phone calls that might delay the auction. But every practical solution was overshadowed by the sheer audacity of the act. Who would even think to do such a thing? To exploit a funeral as leverage, to turn the death of a loved one into a backdrop for financial maneuvering. The injustice was not only real, it was personal. As the service continued around him, Michael felt a steel resolve begin to form beneath the anger. He refused to let this moment define the Harper legacy. Karen Whitmore could try, but she would not succeed. The initial shock of the call had evolved into something more potent. A determination fueled by anger, sharpened by grief, and driven by the memory of a man who had poured his life into protecting his family's home. Michael knew even now that the battle had just begun, and he would face it head-on no matter what obstacles Karen placed in his path. In the stillness of the chapel, surrounded by the muted sobs and quiet prayers, Michael Harper clenched his jaw. The fire of anger burned bright and unrelenting. Karen Whitmore had made her move, but he would not be broken. Not today, not ever. The chapel's quiet was heavy, the air thick with solemn whispers and the faint rustle of tissues against tear-streaked faces. Michael Harper tried to focus on the eulogies, on the kind words friends and neighbors offered in memory of his father, but his mind refused to stay in the moment. Instead, it wandered to the ranch, the sprawling, sun-soaked land that had been in his family for generations, and the devastating thought that it could soon be in the hands of strangers. Each word of praise and remembrance became a blurred echo against the urgent, gnawing fear in his chest. He remembered the smell of hay in the early morning, the way dew would settle on the pastures while he and his father rode horses along the familiar trails. The orchard behind the main house, where his father had spent countless hours teaching him how to prune trees and protect the soil, came alive in his memory. Michael could almost hear his father's voice, calm and patient, guiding him through the lessons of hard work and persistence. Now, those lessons felt fragile, as if they could be swept away in a single stroke of bureaucratic cruelty. The phone calls began almost immediately after the funeral, each one a reminder of the harsh reality he faced. Lawyers spoke in measured, impersonal tones, reviewing forms and deadlines with clinical detachment. The HOA meetings were equally frustrating, filled with jargon and polite refusals to discuss anything beyond procedure. Every response was cold, impersonal, and heartless, as though the people behind the rules could not see or feel the weight of grief that had brought him to their offices. Michael's anger from earlier was replaced, at least temporarily, by a heavy, bone-deep ache, an almost physical sense of helplessness that made his chest constrict and his hands tremble. It wasn't only the thought of losing the ranch, it was the thought of losing the connection to his father, the tangible legacy of a life filled with care, pride, and love. Each pasture, each fence post, each worn wooden gate had a story. They weren't just structures, they were living memories. And yet, in the cold logic of paperwork and HOA regulations, memories meant nothing. Michael felt the injustice like a persistent thorn beneath his ribs, impossible to ignore, impossible to soothe. He walked through the empty rooms of the ranch office later that afternoon, each step echoing against the hardwood floors, the walls lined with framed photos of family gatherings and harvest celebrations. The silence pressed on him, a stark contrast to the chaos inside his mind. His father had built this home as a sanctuary, a place where family and tradition could thrive, and now, without warning, it was threatened by rules written in ink and enforced with detached precision. Every attempt to find a workaround seemed to hit a wall. Every call ended with the same polite yet inflexible refusal. There was nothing to be done, nothing that could be changed, nothing that could be postponed. Michael's grief was no longer just sorrow. It was compounded by a crushing helplessness. He felt suspended between mourning and action, unable to fully participate in either. Memories of laughter around the dinner table, of summer barbecues under white oak trees, of quiet evenings with his father poring over ranch accounts, clashed with the possibility that all of it could be erased by people who had no connection to the land, no respect for the family history, no empathy for the loss he was enduring. Late into the afternoon, as the sun lowered itself behind the hills surrounding the ranch, Michael sat on the porch swing his father had built with his own hands. He let the wind brush against his face, carrying with it the scent of the orchard and freshly mowed fields. He closed his eyes and tried to breathe through the ache, through the relentless weight of grief paired with helplessness. In that moment, he understood the depth of the fight he was about to face. It wasn't just about land or money. It was about legacy, memory, and the principle that even in the face of bureaucratic indifference, some things were worth defending with every ounce of strength. The pain was almost unbearable, but beneath it lay a spark, small, fragile, yet unyielding. Michael Harper knew the road ahead would be difficult, that the fight would test him in ways he could not yet imagine. And yet, even in the suffocating ache of helplessness, he understood that surrender was not an option. The ranch, and the memory of the father who had nurtured it, demanded resistance. The weight of grief and helplessness had pressed heavily on Michael Harper for nearly 24 hours. Yet in the quiet of that morning, a spark flickered. Jake Harper, his younger brother, had arrived at the house after the funeral, bearing a calm, measured energy that Michael desperately needed. Jake was a man shaped by discipline and determination. Military service had instilled in him a keen sense of focus, a presence that could turn panic into strategy. As they sat together at the kitchen table, Michael pored over emails, documents, and notices from the HOA. His hands trembled as he read the bureaucratic language, the cold words that threatened to erase generations of his family's legacy. Jake leaned forward, resting his forearms on the worn oak tabletop. "Michael," he said, his voice steady but intense, "all of this is just words. The HOA thinks they can scare us, but they've underestimated one thing: our family's resolve. There are rules, sure, but no rule can override the fact that this ranch has history, that it's ours in more ways than one." For the first time since the funeral, Michael felt a small, tentative sense of clarity. The hopelessness that had been gnawing at him began to recede, replaced by a cautious determination. He realized that the fight wasn't over, and more importantly, it was winnable. He and Jake made a plan, carefully calculating how to approach the auction, how to confront Karen Whitmore without letting emotions cloud their strategy. By the afternoon, the sky had cleared, casting golden sunlight over the ranch that seemed almost symbolic, a reminder of what was at stake. Michael climbed into his truck with Jake, driving the familiar winding roads that led to the property. Each mile brought with it a mixture of anxiety and resolve. The ranch stretched out before them, every field and fence post imbued with memories of summers past, of his father's guidance, of long evenings spent under wide, open skies. Michael felt that the land itself was calling on him to stand firm. They arrived just as the auctioneer was preparing the first bid. Karen Whitmore stood at the center, perfectly poised, her clipboard in hand, a faint, confident smile touching her lips. The staff she had assembled followed her every gesture with rigid attentiveness. To anyone else, the scene might have seemed ordinary, but to Michael it was a challenge, a gauntlet thrown down in the most public, calculated way imaginable. Michael took a deep breath, letting the weight of loss and anger fuel a quiet, controlled energy. He didn't shout. He didn't make empty threats. Instead, he let his presence speak. Jake stepped beside him, a steady figure of resolve, his calm intensity complementing Michael's emotional charge. They walked slowly to the center of the space, each step deliberate, measured. The room seemed to pause, the murmur of the crowd fading to a tense cylinder. Then, with a controlled hand and unflinching focus, Jake fired a single warning shot into the air. Not aimed at anyone, not meant to harm, but loud enough to draw attention, loud enough to send a clear signal. The sound echoed off the walls, reverberating in the auction hall and through the crowd. Karen's expression shifted instantly, surprise, then a flash of uncertainty, then recognition. The message was unmistakable. The Harper family was present, resolute, and not to be underestimated. The auctioneer faltered. The first bid left hanging in the air as the reality of the moment sank in. Michael's pulse raced, but he felt a strange, steady calm under the adrenaline, a clarity born of purpose. He and Jake had reminded everyone in the room of a truth that no amount of paperwork could override. Some things are earned, defended, and held through commitment and courage. For the first time since the news of the auction, Michael allowed himself a small, guarded optimism. The battle had begun, but he felt deep in his chest that this time he would not lose. The ranch, the land his father had loved and nurtured, was more than property. It was history, legacy, and family. And in that moment, Michael realized that hope was no longer just a distant possibility. It was alive, tangible, and fiercely within reach. The room held its breath, the tension shifting subtly. Karen and her team understood in that instant that manipulation and bureaucracy could not succeed against resolve, presence, and courage. Michael had found his foothold and the tide was turning. The room was heavy with tension when the warning shot rang out, but within moments, an unexpected shift took place. Karen Whitmore, who had carried herself with the air of someone untouchable, her clipboard and schedule a symbol of control, froze mid-step. Her confident posture faltered, and her carefully curated expression of authority crumbled into something far more human. Uncertainty. The auctioneer, likewise, hesitated, the first bid hanging in the air as if suspended by the collective realization of what had just occurred. Michael Harper felt a surge of relief wash over him. This was the moment, the months of planning, the sleepless nights spent combing through legal documents, and the hours of discussion with his brother had been building toward. The realization that the auction had effectively halted, at least for the time being, was more than a small victory. It was a declaration that the Harper family's legacy could not be stripped away by cold bureaucracy or vindictive intent. News of the incident spread rapidly. Within hours, neighbors and friends were calling and sending messages, offering support and sharing their disbelief at the audacity of the HOA's actions. Local media outlets picked up the story, framing it as a cautionary tale about overreach, while simultaneously highlighting Michael's composure and courage under extreme pressure. Karen Whitmore, once the figure of unquestioned authority in the neighborhood, now faced scrutiny and public questioning. The tide had shifted and the Harper family stood firm, a beacon of resilience against systemic arrogance. Walking once more through the familiar fields of the ranch, Michael allowed himself to breathe in deeply. The air was filled with the scent of freshly cut grass, the earthy aroma of tilled soil, and the subtle sweetness of ripening fruit in the orchard. Each sensory detail seemed sharper, more vivid, as though the land itself were affirming that it remained in the hands of those who had nurtured it for generations. Michael's chest tightened, but not from fear or helplessness this time, from a profound mix of sorrow and pride. He mourned his father still, of course, but the grief had been tempered by the knowledge that the legacy his father had built was safe, and that the principles his family valued had been vindicated. Jake clapped him on the shoulder, a quiet smile passing between them. They had faced a seemingly insurmountable obstacle and emerged not only victorious but also more united. Michael realized that the fight had been more than about property. It had been a test of spirit, of character, and of the willingness to stand firm in the face of injustice. The victory was not simply for the Harper family. It was a message to the wider community that courage, presence, and resolve could counter even the most calculated attempts at control. In the following days, conversations in the neighborhood shifted. Homeowners who had previously felt intimidated or resigned began questioning HOA practices more openly. They discussed policies and overreach, sharing stories of minor injustices and exploring ways to protect themselves and their families. Michael had unwittingly become a symbol. His stand at the ranch inspiring others to recognize that the rules on paper did not have to dictate the reality of human decency and fairness. Standing atop a small rise near the main house, Michael gazed across the expanse of the ranch. The orchards, the pastures, the fences, every detail bore the imprint of his father's care, and now of the Harper family's determination. It was a place of memory, of learning, of love and labor, and it remained theirs. Michael felt a quiet awe at the resilience that had carried them through the ordeal, a recognition of the strength that could emerge even in moments of profound grief and apparent defeat. As the sun dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows across the land, Michael understood something fundamental. The ranch was more than property. It was a symbol of resilience, a testament to courage and a living reminder that standing up for what is right can preserve not only tangible legacies but also the spirit and dignity of those who defend them. The Harper family's fight had been challenging, but in its conclusion lay inspiration. Not only for them, but for everyone who might one day face their own moment of injustice. For Michael, the triumph was quiet but powerful. The sorrow remained, the absence of his father felt in every corner of the land, yet the victory brought with it a profound sense of completeness. Justice had been restored not through aggression or chaos, but through presence, resolve, and unwavering commitment. And in that restoration, the Harper Ranch became more than a home. It became a symbol shining bright with the enduring light of human courage and the uncompromising defense of what truly matters.